Welcome to our webinar, Understanding Testing Requirements for Additive Orthopedic Devices. Our speaker is Maciej Jakuki, Technical Director and Medical Device Manager at Element. For over 3 decades, medical device manufacturers have worked with Element as their trusted testing partner for device testing from feasibility R&D studies to full regulatory submissions. Element specializes in evaluating orthopedic devices and offers a wide range of accredited medical device testing, including mechanical, material, biological, package, and EMC/EMI safety testing.
All right, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining this on-demand webinar on testing and qualifying additively manufactured orthopedic devices. I'll start with a quick overview of Element Materials Technology. So Element is a global provider of testing, inspection, certification services in the aerospace, transportation, industrials, life sciences, connected technologies, and fire and building product sectors. With almost 6,000 engaged experts around 200 locations, we have close to 50,000 customers in 30 plus countries. Element specializes in destructive and non-destructive materials testing, product qualification testing, certification, advisory services, and calibration. By helping our customers develop better products and get them to market faster, they can save time and money while minimizing risk with product development and production. We make certain that the materials and products we test are safe, quality, compliant, and fit for purpose. As it pertains to this talk and the OMTech Forum, Element's area of expertise within the life sciences falls into 2 categories. On the left side of the screen is product qualification testing, and the other being materials characterization. So we have testing experience with diagnostic, therapeutic, and implantable products, focusing on electrical product safety, EMC, EMI, wireless coexistence, and all things related to IEC 60601. We have a heavy presence in mechanical testing for orthopedic and additive products with static and fatigue and wear testing capabilities. Similarly, in cardiovascular, we focus on pulsatile and axial durability for stents and heart valve structures. A growing area, particularly over the last 12 months with COVID, is around testing disinfectant and antimicrobial products. We also have a pharmaceutical group that supports drug development and small batch manufacturing alongside analytical services. So for medical device, this includes things like extractables and leachables, chemical characterization. And then finally, really understanding and providing testing services for materials characterization, supporting production with tensile, chemistry, metallography, process validation testing, and this is where a lot of our additive expertise is located. So after that brief intro, I'll jump into the presentation. I wanted to highlight some advantages around additive for orthopedic medical devices. So to start and lay the groundwork, this is a periodic helical beam matrix designed and printed by Tangible Solutions in Dayton, Ohio, and it has all kinds of interlocking and interconnecting struts. Notice the surface roughness, the structure porosity, the pattern looking into the matrix, and also a repeating shape lattice. So I wanted to start there because you can see some key advantages of the matrix. We know that titanium and bone like each other, and if we can mimic existing structures or kind of increase surface roughness, surface area, we can maximize the amount of osseointegration. But the question is really what shape or what structure, what roughness, what behavior of the lattice can result in the best integration. So working in the test lab, we get to see all kinds of matrix designs, and the software platforms and industry skill sets keep evolving to come up with new shapes that are hopefully stronger and more aligned to the original bone structure. Another thought is about the stability and a matrix performance. So what is the optimal configuration that combines design and material strength in a 1x1 unit cell? Can that be extrapolated to a 10x10 and so forth, and how linear and nonlinear is that relationship going to be? Stiffness control is another advantage where you're really trying to replicate bone and reduce the mismatch between the bone and the implant. And the last advantage relates with patient-specific design. So think of a cranial or maxillofacial application, maybe a cancer therapy, patient-specific jigs or implants that are custom-made based on MRI or CT scans. So additive is applicable to many different kinds of implants, and I'll highlight some here. So this is a sample build plate. You can see different kinds of implants. There's acetabular cups, there's spine cages, there's tibial trays. There's a lot of work being done in knees and shoulders as well. hip stems remain relatively sort of unchanged, but if you can combine sort of the lattice functionality of additive into the body of the stem, can we get to a point where we can improve outcomes and maybe fatigue performance? I've seen several unique concepts over the last year or two, and you can see in the photo the different lattices on the lateral and medial sides creating an auxetic structure, essentially a negative Poisson's ratio, which was really interesting. Stents is another area. So think about nitinol and how temperature sensitive it is. You know, put it in the additive process, and all of a sudden that gets really complex. You're looking at transition temperatures, we're looking at really small geometries, and I think there's a lot of potential in the cardiovascular space. I talked a little bit about patient-specific implants. There's a lot more 3D printed jigs and fixtures, instruments and guides and so forth that can be turned in pretty quick times, as well as work being done in the dental industry, leveraging additive. So custom bridges, implants that can really sort of transform the common approaches. So, many of these legacy sort of traditionally manufactured devices have established standards for the designs, but throw in some additive processes and all of a sudden there's a lot more regulatory questions. So, where do we go and get guidance? The first place you really should stop is the technical considerations FDA guidance document. If you haven't read it, I strongly suggest you go find it, take a look at it, read through it, familiarize yourself with the requirements, because it lays out the process and the thinking behind how you're going to bring your device to market and what you should be thinking about. Another key area is the ASTM F42 Committee on Additive Manufacturing Technologies. With all the options of additive, are we ever going to be able to sort of standardize everything? No, absolutely not. But we can create a strong baseline for the industry. And within F42, and there's a lot of work being done in the task groups under the test methods, the design, the materials and the processes, environment, health and safety, and just overall terminology. So it's universal across the board. If you aren't aware of what's under development, I strongly recommend you join F42. There's a lot of committees focusing on things like, and I'll kind of look through the list, test artifacts and compression validation coupons for lattice designs, orientation and location dependence and mechanical properties, mechanical testing of polymers, non-destructive testing, qualification principles and preparation of specimens. And it's really a great way to make new connections, to be able to have a lot of discussions that you're probably asking internally anyway, and you're expanding your network of experts and expertise. So outside of the guidance document and the ASTM committee, there's existing standards, right? So ASTM 3001 is for additively manufactured TI64. 3122 is for evaluating mechanical properties of metal materials via additive. And there's a variety of other ones as well. And so some combination of these three is enough to give you some strong guidance with what's going to happen inside your internal processes. So, how do you connect these specs and sort of guides to your internal processes? We'll talk about that here in a second. So a typical workflow for additive generally looks like this. You input your CAD and design, your CAD, your design. You have your machine prep, kind of sampling, storage, and pre-process. In process, you're actually building or printing. Post-process, you're heat treating, you're removing the base structures, you're finishing. Then your output is sort of the finished part, right? And then the corresponding IQ, OQ, PQ kind of runs in parallel, where you are developing the quality pathway for physical equipment, your product specs, your consistency of equipment performance, and then evaluating the whole process flow with sort of real world considerations. So looking at this tactically and applying it to the testing process, with IQ, OQ, PQ, you're asking questions like, can my machine do it? Is that machine good enough? Can it provide reliable outputs? Will it do what I need it to do? And once you've answered those questions, then you're really looking to get to a product. And once you have that product, you want to confirm you understand the materials and meet any relevant specifications. So as you characterize your builds and you get to a product, then you're ready to evaluate your design and start replicating the physiological loading as a product in accordance with the relevant product specs. So we often get asked, what is sort of the minimum requirement for the testing? And it really depends on your level of risk. It depends on what makes your device unique and what additional risks does your design or process create. So with that, let's dive into some of the considerations and risks for sort of the build process. So if you start thinking about many of these structures, you are looking at a thin wall, you're looking at small diameter struts. What happens if one breaks? What happens if you have some sort of unique geometry that's going to cause a problem? what kind of risk is that going to create? And then how do you mitigate that from a testing perspective? A lot of these will have a small or large, pore sizes that needs to be considered. We've talked a little bit about surface roughness. So anytime you have roughness, you're going to have a stress concentration you have to consider, not sensitivity. That might be okay here on this strut, but it might not be okay here, which is a much, much smaller one. You have to want to think about residual powder and debris. You also need to think about internal fatigue cracks. So as you're running your testing, in a matrix, it can be really difficult to try to find cracks internally. So how do you do that? Can you do it via CT? Do you cross-section it? Do you set displacement criteria? Is it functional? Is it mechanical failure? You want to look at post-processing issues, so issues related to hipping or heat treating. Material defects or incomplete fusion is another area that's important. So I've seen lots of parts come to us that are essentially missing struts. So either broke off or there was incomplete fusion. And that's something that's really critical for the performance of that device. Porosity is another area to consider. Mixed powder ratio is obviously if you're using virgin or blended powder, as well as external dimensions and your support materials. Let's talk a little bit more specifically about the build plate. So, obviously you're taking a look at your X, your Y sort of orientation. You were looking at your packing density, thinking about outer versus inner. Things to consider is the direction of your gas flow, the kind of the worst case from a blade motion perspective. Your layering in the Z and how you're building it and the orientation of the build plate. Those things all have to be considered and evaluated. Other things to consider are the build path, which results to the cooling time. Things like starting materials. So your virgin powder, are you using virgin powder? Are you blending? How often are you blending? How much oxygen are you picking up over time? How do you control your processes? And obviously the post-processing piece, sort of if there's final machining, if there's support structure removal, any other kinds of post-processing that you'll be able to do. Those are things that need to be evaluated. So knowing that you're looking for all of these things, how exactly do you go about testing this? And so when you look at the FDA guidance document, it defines a test coupon as a test coupon's representative sort of test sample of the device or component. The design of test coupons and placement within the build volume can be especially important for AM. Coupons can be simple shapes suitable for destructive testing, something like a tensile bar as shown here, or they can contain one or more structural features, so porosity, internal channel, and so forth, representative of the component, or device that can be accessed using destructive techniques. So a pretty wide open, an open-ended sort of direction here. And I think that as we've seen in the test lab, this is really starting to evolve over time. So talk about a couple of these geometries and what they look like. You can use a standard geometry like a tensile test that we've already talked about, but oftentimes that's not enough because that might give you some material data, but it's not necessarily going to evaluate the form, the design, the kind of function of the matrix that you've created. And this is an example of a couple of spine coupons. So these are custom coupons that were made with that unique geometry for testing purposes. You can see the 3 different types of matrices here. And as they evolve, we're seeing a trend in more and more custom coupon testing, different sizes and making sure that the printed structures are performing. And it's also really easy to then take a look at it visually and see if you have incomplete fusion or if you're missing some things here or there. As the process matures, we're also seeing sort of a final sacrificial part testing and statistical process controls or thresholds to meet and approve each build. So I'll outline some of the kinds of testing that we routinely see. Obviously, we see a lot. We've mentioned tensile testing a couple of times, but also compression testing, either per E9. There's another spec that talks about compression testing for additive, as well as the custom geometries. Things like chemistry are really important. Metallography, microstructure evaluations also are performed relatively often. Let's see what else is there. Porosity, measuring either via non-destructive methods, so doing micro CT, or maybe doing a physical slice method where you're actually slicing through and looking at different potential high-risk sort of worst-case regions. Hardness testing also gives a good analysis of what's going on. Density is one that's important that we see. And then a couple of sort of other things to consider, maybe a dimensional inspection or dimensional check if you have a key geometry that needs to be evaluated, or you are looking for, you're seeing issues in the past. So maybe, being a go, no go type of inspection for dimensional or sort of measurements. I mentioned visual inspection of critical regions, so if there is a particular area that is of concern. And maybe considering some other loading modalities, maybe a torsion or shear. We've seen work being done in that space as well, depending again on your risks or your unique design applications and so forth. So no testing presentation can be complete without a video of something being crushed or broken. So here's an example of a custom compression coupon being tested. So you can see how the structure moves as forces applied and how they start to sort of pop as they fail. I'll play this again here, just so you can see. I don't have the audio, but if I did, you could audibly hear sort of each strap popping and breaking. And again, being able to see it really tells you a lot about how it's going to perform, how it's going to form, which struts are going to go first, and seeing if you can get some level of consistency and being able to predict how the test is going to happen. So that's an example of a static compression custom coupon test, but you can actually take it a step further. And this is a fatigue evaluation of a similar coupon. So you can see how the structure moves throughout the whole matrix. And when these start to fail, and typically one link will go, then you'll hear another link go, and then it'll quickly cascade and start pancake down. So unfortunately, we don't have time to watch the entire fatigue test, but I thought it would be helpful to show here as an example of some of the things that you can do. With the fatigue coupons, maybe there is a target cycle count that you're going for, that you've established kind of a fatigue curve and said, based on these stresses, based on these numbers, this is sort of the goal or threshold that we're trying to reach. Maybe there's some other characteristics that you're thinking about that would be helpful as well. So with this slide, I'm not saying this is universal, because I know that there's some companies look at this, but I thought this was interesting to highlight. There's really sort of a stark difference in thinking between full materials characterization and sort of the bare minimum approach from the medical materials perspective. So if you look at a qualification program for aerospace, for example, it is common to run hundreds of maybe tensils, hundreds of axial fatigue bars through the full volume to start that qualification and replicate sort of additional characterization. So what they're really looking at doing is establishing full confidence that build volume is known and well represented. Then they use that property data to really push the limits of the design, kind of that increase that or reach that margin of design. In aerospace, you're trying to make it as light as possible, use as little material as possible. You want identical and predictable results. There is a low margin for error. You don't want to have an airplane coming out of the sky, right? And you want to be able to predict sort of your service life. So when we see these qualification programs, that's one of the advantages, because we get to see all the different industries, not just med device. And you see the extent to which they go to characterize these materials, and then you compare it to something like medical, where I routinely get the question, well, can I just run a couple of tensils? Sort of what's the minimum requirement? It makes you ask some questions. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that we need to replicate the aerospace approach, but it's something to think about. I know that there's a lot of data on titanium, but we're still learning a lot about the additive process. And I think a lot of the approach for the questions like that in medical come from thinking, well, we're going to get fusion in 10 or 12 weeks. Can't really replace the part. Maybe there's a bit of a higher risk tolerance because failure isn't necessarily catastrophic and so forth. But I think for anyone thinking about risks and thinking about this process, it's really important to understand the material properties of your printer volumes. Again, I'm not necessarily suggesting that we abandon this approach, but I think there's a lot of work to be done, and we can sort of take an example from some of the other industries. So I've spoken a lot on coupon testing and wanted to highlight some considerations for final product. So this is an example of a spine cage, and this will be, you can insert hip, knee, anything else that you want in here. And what I want to highlight is when you additively manufacture that part, you still have to perform all the typical test methods for that part that you would normally see using traditional manufacturing. So in this case, the ASTM 2077 outlines the testing requirements for a spine cage. And what you have to do is really 2077 plus. So there's additional things that you have to consider from a product perspective. So you always want to be testing in fluid. That's absolutely critical for a couple of reasons. You want to be capturing the wear debris that's coming out of it. And then being able to look at things like size, shape, looking at the overall morphology. You want to weigh your parts as well, pre and post mass loss, to as many decimal weights as you can get, to try to understand and prove that there either is material coming off, there is not material coming off. I mentioned the debris morphology per ASTM of 1877. Metal ion analysis is another area that's critical. If you're in the medical space, you know that released ions can cause local inflammation, loosening, allergies, sensitivities, failures, and so forth. And so all of this is being captured sort of inside of that fluid, and where you can be doing that analysis. Enhanced inspection. So again, coming back to some of the risks and understanding your key design features, maybe you need to put in some processes for key things to look for in order to mitigate any of those kinds of risks. And ultimately, when you are testing this, you need to understand your physiological worst case. It might be the smallest cross-sectional area, it might be your tallest implant, it might be some other configuration. But then you also have to consider the additive features. So, how do you sort of inspect the inside of the matrix without removing the part from the test, and so forth. So, hopefully in the last 15 minutes or so, I've been able to give a good overview of how you should be thinking about testing your additive products and sort of what some of the requirements are, from sort of initial powder testing to validation through IQ, PQ, through coupon testing, through final product testing, and ultimately into your regulatory submission. So I hope this was informational. I hope that this was helpful, and I appreciate your time here. So to wrap things up, just a couple of quick points. You want to make sure that you're thinking about the risks of the materials and the design, and you want to think about them separately, but you also understand that they go together. You want to review your process and evaluate the best approach to mitigate your risks. If you can, integrate existing specifications or workflows, but consider your unique application. And if the three of them fail for whatever reason, you're not sure, look to the committees and look to see if you can get involved and ask some questions. You're really going to learn a lot that way. And you can always call Element. Feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any additional questions. So with that, I appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you for listening to this webinar on testing additive orthopedic devices. You see some of the contact information up on screen. And again, thank you for your time. Appreciate it. Bye.
Thank you to Mache, and thank you to those watching. You can learn more about Element at element.com or contact them via the link on the session homepage. To access more expertise from orthopedic service providers and contract manufacturers, visit omtechexpo.com.